Okay, so I need to be clear about this. The term complex hazard does not mean a trap designed by Rube Goldberg. Is that confusing? Well, let's talk about simple hazards and complex hazards in Pathfinder 2e on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the local disaster tour guide. That's right, I am a storyteller here to tell you, it's a trap. No, that meme's not going away this month, I'm sorry. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today, we are returning to Trap Month in my Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series. This is a series where we take a look at the tips, the tricks, and the advice that Paizo gives game masters in Pathfinder 2e, and this month we are talking about hazards. We're talking about traps. We're talking about all of those fun, dangerous, and deadly obstacles that we use to trip up our players whenever they delve too deep into the dungeon. This series is intended for storytellers of every skill level from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2e is not your preferred game, I still invite you to be part of the conversation, because one of the things that I have found is that studying a variety of games often helps us return to our preferred game with new ideas that we can use. Last week, we kicked off Trap Month by talking about one of the ways that Pathfinder 2e classifies traps with environmental hazards, traps, and haunts, and what those terms meant mechanically inside of the game. This week, we're taking a look at a second way that Pathfinder 2e classifies hazards by talking about simple hazards versus complex hazards, what that means mechanically, and what we should think about as storytellers when using simple and complex hazards inside of our games. Stick around for this series. Next week, we're going to be taking a look at the Design a Hazard rules from the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e, and in part 4 of this series, I am going to be building some custom hazards using those hazard building rules. By the way, you can be a part of that video by giving me your best suggestion for an interesting trap name that I can build in that video. So, whether you like environmental hazards, traps, or haunts, and whether you prefer simple or complex hazards, pitch me the most interesting names that you have for traps down in the comments section, and if I think that your name is inspiring, I just might build it. By the way, yes, this is my not-so-subtle way of transitioning to all of the YouTube stuff. That is a sad necessity of keeping a YouTube channel going. So if you enjoy this video, please like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. Leave your thoughts, comments, and observation in the comments section down below. Yes, it feeds the algorithm, but more importantly, it encourages me as a content creator. I love interacting with you all. I love hearing your insights. I love getting your feedback. And so much of the best part of this job is hearing from you, so definitely give me your thoughts, definitely be a part of the conversation. If you want to get more involved with the local disaster tour guide community, you can check out my free Discord, which is linked in the video description, and down in the video description as well, you'll find a link to my Patreon page if you would like to support this channel financially. Recently, I got a new patron who goes by the name The Greatest Mother-in-Law Ever. Huh. Wonder who that could be. Anyways, thank you so much for your support. And if you're interested in helping to support this channel financially or through any other means, please do so. It means the world to me. And speaking of support for the channel, here's a quick cut to the sponsor ad. So I want to give a huge shout out to the sponsor of today's video, ArcKnight. ArcKnight is a Texas-based company that makes beautiful and durable die-cut plastic accessories for TTRPGs, such as flat plastic minis, object sheets, spell templates, and the number one reason they keep getting a lot of my money, RPG maps. ArcKnight sells a number of double-sided map packs that you can use for your TTRPGs that come with different themes such as wilderness or planar settings, or as you can see here, the Greystone Castle pack. Let's bust out these maps on the table and show you what they look like. So really quick, I'm going to show you one of the sample layouts that they give you for the Greystone Citadel. As you can see here, you have a moat and an entrance area. You have some basic fortifications for the castle, and even a throne room for your players to enter. Now the next thing that I'd like to do is I'd like to step back a bit. This is one of my old RPG maps, and you see the standard folds, crinkles, creases, and other wear and tear that is associated with your standard RPG map. But as you can see, my maps from ArcKnight are actually much flatter and in better condition, and the reason is these maps don't fold, they just store as is. This leads to a more durable product that gets less wear and tear as it ages. Also, I would like to zoom in and show you something really cool about ArcKnight's maps. As you can see here, I am one of those weird storytellers that likes to use hex grids instead of square grids. And the cool thing about ArcKnight's maps is you can custom order these maps in whatever type of grid you prefer. Do you prefer the normal square grids? You can order it that way. Do you want to custom order all of their maps with hex grids like I did? That's a possibility. And even though I don't have an example here, you can also order their maps completely gridless if that's your preferred playstyle. And to give you one more sample of what ArcKnight maps look like, here is a recent construction that I used in one of my games to create a tavern for my players to explore. As you can see, the map is colorful, has light sources indicated, and once again, allow me to point out that they allowed me to order it with a custom hex grid to fit my group's gaming style. So that's just a sample of the many different maps that ArcKnight offers. I love that these maps are beautiful, that they're durable, and very easy to store. These simple plastic sleeves tuck very neatly beside my computer desk and are very easy to store and access for my games. I really appreciate the fact that ArcKnight develops products that are easy to store as a game master, meaning that I have more room for, well, all of the other stuff in my gaming space. One last thing I'd like to say about ArcKnight is the incredible respect that I have for their team. I have been a customer of ArcKnight for years, backing many of their Kickstarters, even talking to them at Gen Con, and I have placed many orders with this company. And on the single occasion that there was an error with one of my orders, their customer service team worked quickly and efficiently to get that order fixed and sent back out to me. I'm impressed by their professionalism and by the quality of products and services they provide. So if you want to check them out, I encourage you to check out the link to their website in the video description. And thank you again, ArcKnight, for sponsoring this video. Alright, before we dive into the subject today, I always like to give you some references that you can read up on if you want to research this topic a little more in depth on your own. For Trap Month, we kind of have the same references each and every week. We're looking at pages 520 to 529 of the core rulebook and pages 74 to 81 of the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e. Both of these sections talk about hazards and give us several sample hazards that we can use to kind of understand the rules and the concepts that we are discussing. So that's where you can go if you want to read more on this topic, but let's get started. Alright, so as I said, today we're going to be talking about simple versus complex hazards. This is one of the ways that Pathfinder 2e helps to categorize hazards inside of the game. And simple and complex can apply to any of the categories from last week's video. So environmental hazards, traps, haunts, all of these can classify as simple or complex hazards. But I want to start off by asking the question, what makes a hazard simple or complex? The terminology seems, forgive me for the pun, simple enough, but what does it mean to say that a hazard is simple? And what does it mean to say that a hazard is complex? Are magical hazards automatically complex, or can they be simple? And are mechanical hazards automatically simple or complex? Where is the dividing line between these two categories? I want you to think for a moment how you would define a simple and a complex hazard, and then we'll do a test to see how Pathfinder 2e defines the terms. Alright, do you have your idea? What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 5 different hazards that are listed either in the core rulebook or the Game Mastery Guide for Pathfinder 2e, and I want you to guess which hazards you think are simple hazards and which hazards you think are complex hazards. We'll start with a classic. Up first, the Pit Trap. Second, Quicksand. Third, the Planar Rift. Fourth, the Poison Dart Gallery. Fifth, the Armageddon Orb. Alright, do you have your guesses? How many of those were simple and how many were complex? If you said there are 3 simple hazards and 2 complex hazards, you're correct. But now, can you tell me which ones are which? If you said that the Pit Trap, the Planar Rift, and the Armageddon Orb are simple hazards, congratulations, you got it right. All 3 of those are classified as simple hazards according to Pathfinder 2e, while Quicksand and the Poison Dart Gallery are both examples of complex hazards. And I use those examples to bring up an important point. The definition of a simple versus a complex hazard is very basic and revolves around what is essentially one element of hazard design as a game master. Do you run your hazard as a single reaction to something that your party does, or do you run your hazard more like almost a creature that has its own initiative count? The gameplay mechanical distinction of a complex hazard is any hazard that rolls initiative and acts inside of initiative inside of your game. So you can think of a simple hazard as any kind of hazard, environmental, trap, haunt, whatever it may be, that reacts when triggered, and then once that reaction is over, the trap is effectively done. A complex hazard, however, will have its own initiative count. As the trap is doing its thing, your players will also have time to react and act and do their own activities, and complex hazards become almost this race against the clock to see if your players can escape or beat what is happening before the trap overtakes them. Quicksand is a good example of this. Quicksand rolls initiative because every so often that quicksand is going to pull the player character a little bit further down. But it doesn't happen instantaneously. Players have a chance to make athletics checks and to try to pull each other out of the quicksand or to try to move to safety in one way or another. And there is a race against time element to battling quicksand that makes it a complex hazard inside of the rules, even if the concept of quicksand itself might seem simple to you and I. Because the best way to manage quicksand requires you to roll initiative, well, that's what makes it a complex hazard. Now, one thing I want to note here is there is an element of trap design that might seem like it's related to simple versus complex hazards, but actually has no bearing on this distinction, and that is the concept of, does the trap reset? Simple traps might have some way of resetting, or once they've been used, they might be completely expended. The presence or lack of a reset option for a simple hazard has no bearing on whether or not it is considered to be a simple hazard. Complex hazards, at least as far as I can tell in Pathfinder 2e, every example they give us has some sort of automatic reset built into the hazard, but there is nothing mechanical in Pathfinder 2e that says a complex hazard must have a reset of some kind. And even in my own casual thoughts, I have come up with more than a few ideas of complex hazards that might require an initiative count to really properly run that scenario, but once the scenario plays out, I can imagine that complex hazard being fully expended. So even though most of the examples of complex hazards that I have seen have a reset, that doesn't mean that it is mandatory for a complex hazard to have a reset. It just seems to be commonplace. Instead, the core mechanical necessities for a simple hazard is simply a trigger and a reaction, while a complex hazard will typically have a trigger, an initiative skill of some kind, and then a series of actions or reactions that it performs in a routine inside of the initiative count. Those are the things that distinguish simple versus complex hazards. Okay, so now that we understand the definition of simple and complex hazard, the next thing we want to ask is, what should we as storytellers think about when we consider using simple and complex hazards inside of our game? Now, I will go ahead and say that the core rulebook doesn't give us a lot of advice here. It mostly just gives us the information we need to run simple and complex hazards. But the Game Mastery Guide does offer some advice on both categories, and we're going to start with simple hazards because simple hazards are one of the easier types of hazards to make, well, to be honest, boring. The number one piece of advice that Paizo gives us in the Game Mastery Guide when it comes to simple hazards is this: think beyond damage dice. Most of the time, when we think about simple hazards, we often think about basically static sources of damage that exist inside the environment. This is the spear trap that launches out of the wall. This is the pit trap that your character falls into. You encounter them, they fire off, they hit your character, and they cause your character to expend resources, hit points, probably healing of some kind, before your character can move on towards whatever their goal may be. The typical simple hazard is basically just a mechanical speed bump of a game, and a lot of traps are boring because all too often as game masters, that's all we do with them. We use them to inflict damage on a player, and then we're done. Now, I'm not saying you should never use a simple hazard that just deals damage as its effect, but what I am saying here is when you use a simple hazard, you want to ask yourself, is there something I can do beyond the damage dice to make this engaging to the story? Does this hazard inflict a condition that might make it more difficult for my players as they progress further through the dungeon? Or does this hazard modify the environment in some way that combat becomes a lot more interesting and a lot more dangerous? Think about the classic pit trap. A pit trap is basically the definition of just dealing some damage and then letting people move on. Your character falls in, they take damage, and then their party pulls them out and they move on. But imagine for a moment if your players encounter a pit trap, maybe they fall in, maybe they don't, but a few seconds later, a monster comes charging out of the darkness, and now your players are battling alongside this pit trap. Maybe the monster can knock them in for extra damage, or maybe they can knock the monster in and contain it inside of the pit. Or if you're feeling particularly mean, I've had a game master do this to me. Maybe there's a monster in the pit, and the character that falls in the pit has to try to struggle to survive while the rest of the party is trying to get them out of the pit. Even a simple damaging trap can become a lot more interesting when you find ways to use it in context of the environment and story to make it more meaningful to your players. Let me give you another example. Your players are breaking into a nobleman's house and trying to recover a mysterious artifact that they believe that the noble has stolen. As they search through the home, they struggle to find it until all of a sudden they come across a locked chest that is very clearly trapped. Is it possible that this is the chest they've been looking for? Simple hazards may have a basic trigger and a simple effect, and once the trap is fired off, it may be done in terms of its mechanical effect on gameplay, but if you think creatively about simple hazards and how they relate to the environment and to the story, you can still get a lot of narrative use out of them. Complex hazards, as befits their name, have a little more to think about when we consider how to use them as storytellers. Now, as we've already noted, a complex hazard is going to roll initiative, and every turn it's going to act on its turn based on, well, the parameters of the trap. Complex hazards will almost always have a number of actions and typically a set routine that the trap follows that will determine how it acts inside of the initiative count. When you are building a complex hazard, one of the things that you have to consider is how many actions will this hazard have, and what is the routine that this hazard is going to follow. Most of the examples that I have seen from the core rulebook and the Game Mastery Guide will give complex hazards between 1 to 4 actions that it uses on its turn, and the typical number seems to be 3 actions, but that's not a hard and fast rule. I've seen as little as 1 action on a turn, and I've seen as many as 4 actions being repeated every turn by a complex hazard. As a Game Master, you want to think, what does this trap do? How many actions does it need? And what is the routine that this trap is programmed to follow so that you know how to properly run it inside of the game? One of my favorite examples of a complex hazard is just this spinning ball of blades that is rolling around the room, and at the start of its turn it spends an action to strike an adjacent character, and then it moves or bounces in a particular direction, and then for its last action attempts to strike any characters that it ends adjacent to. And then it just repeats this routine every round. Strike an adjacent character, bounce somewhere, strike again. Figuring out this routine and how it'll work inside of the initiative count is the first thing that you really have to crack as a storyteller, but there are some other considerations that you want to think about as well. One of the things you want to seriously consider is, how do I expect my characters to disable or stop this complex hazard? What kind of skill checks do they need to make, or how much damage do they need to deal to the trap's components if they want to disable or destroy this particular device? Now, some complex hazards will only require 1 check to disable, but many complex hazards inside Pathfinder 2e will require a series of successful checks to fully disable, and one of the interesting pieces of advice that Paizo offers is, if a complex hazard has multiple actions as part of its routine, and multiple skill checks that are necessary to overcome that hazard, then one of the things you can do to help your players get a sense of progress during the encounter is to allow a successful check or a successful amount of damage to remove actions from the hazard until it is fully disabled. So maybe the hazard starts with 3 actions in a round, and the first successful check knocks that down to 2, second check knocks it down to 1, with the third check fully disabling the complex hazard. Also, I'm not sure if I should point this out, because I feel like players everywhere are going to cry, why would I do such a thing? But Paizo does include this advice, and if you're the kind of game master who likes to play a little crazy and very deadly, they do point out that if you need an excuse to bump up the damage of your complex hazard, adding a random element to its routine is often a good excuse to make the trap a little more deadly. Remember that bouncing ball of blades earlier? They note that because that bouncing ball of blades moves in a random direction each round, that gives you a little more excuse to make the trap deadlier in terms of how much damage it deals. So if you need an excuse to laugh maniacally, there you go. Ultimately, when you're thinking about a complex hazard, what you're really thinking about is almost a combat encounter. Sure, the hazard may not be a full creature, but it's going to act in many ways like a creature would act. It will have initiative, it will likely move around the battle, its routine may cause it to do different and unpredictable things during the course of that encounter, and it is totally legit to drop a complex hazard in the middle of a regular fight scene. You can have a lot of fun doing that, but when you build a complex hazard, it's best to think of it big picture as if it's its own combat encounter. Sure, the players may be resolving that encounter through skill checks or by escaping the area, but you're still going to be using a lot of combat mechanics And so thinking of it through that lens of this is a combat encounter can help you really flesh out how to use that complex hazard in play. So that's the distinction between simple hazards and complex hazards. It's really that basic. Does the hazard roll initiative or not? But behind that question of rolling initiative or not rolling initiative, there are many other things that go into how do we use hazards and how do we make sure that they have an excellent narrative impact on our players. Next week, I'm going to be going through the rules for designing hazards that Paizo gives us in the Game Mastery Guide. We're going to be taking a look at hazard stats, we're going to be taking a look at the advice and the tips that they give us for designing effective hazards, and we're going to be breaking down step by step the things you need to do to build effective hazards in your game. But for now, I'm going to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on simple or complex hazards, and are you surprised by the definitions that Paizo uses inside of their game? What are some of your favorite examples of simple and complex hazards? And don't forget, what are some of your favorite names for hazards that I might build toward the end of this month? Let me know in the comments down below. And as I said earlier, if you enjoyed this video, like it, share it, subscribe to the channel. Check out my free Discord and my Patreon, links in the video description. And you can check out this video sponsor, ArcKnight. I'll have a link for them in the video description as well. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. Have a wonderful day.